Imagine standing in a massive sun-baked quarry in Lebanon. You are looking at a single solid block of limestone. It is 19 meters long, 4 meters high, and it weighs, well, roughly 800 tons.
Which is just a staggering amount of weight.
Right. Now imagine someone telling you that you need to move that block nearly a kilometer over uneven ground, and your only available tools are wood, ropes, and human muscle.
Yeah, for most of us today, that just sounds completely impossible. Our brains kind of short circuit.
Exactly. But a new white paper proves our brains are simply looking at the math wrong. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a really fascinating March 2026 release from the Prothean Institute titled Lost Coherence, written by James Ilos.
It's a brilliant piece of work.
It really is. And the mission of this deep dive is to answer a truly mind-bending question, which is, how did ancient societies actually build these impossible monuments? And perhaps, much more importantly, what does the answer reveal about the invisible structures of trust and coordination that modern society has, essentially, completely dismantled?
Yeah, to answer that, we are going to look at raw physical engineering, historical labor strikes, and some deeply revealing demographic data. We really have to look past simple archaeology and examine the structural mathematics of human coordination.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the physical mystery that kicks off the paper, right? The staggering scale of ancient monuments. I mean, I mentioned that limestone block in Lebanon.
Right, the Baalbek trilithons.
Yeah, the paper focuses intensely on those. These are 3 massive blocks incorporated into a Roman-era temple platform, and they were moved 800 meters from their quarry. For centuries, people have looked at these stones or, the Great Pyramids or Pumapunku in Bolivia and jumped to some pretty wild sci-fi conclusions.
Well, the exotic technology hypothesis is always the easiest escape hatch for the modern mind, I think. Lost civilizations, alien progenitors, ancient levitation magic, things like that.
And the author violently rejects that. The paper argues that the gap isn't technology at all. The gap is entirely in our modern imagination. We are projecting our very modern, highly individualized short-term thinking onto ancient peoples who simply did not operate the way we do.
Precisely. The author strips away the magic and looks strictly at conventional physics.
Yep.
And they propose a very practical, physically grounded solution for moving the Baalbek stones, which is a lever trireme mechanism.
Wait, a trireme, like those ancient Greek warships with rows and rows of oarsmen?
That is the exact principle, yes. In a trireme, you achieve massive propulsive force, not from one giant, sophisticated engine, but from the synchronized, relentless coordination of many individual oarsmen.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it is aggregate force produced by flawless collective coordination. The paper applies this exact logic to an 800-ton stone block. So picture 88 heavy timber levers, 44, positioned on each side of the block.
Wow. I am just visualizing this as a massive synchronized centipede made of wood and stone.
That's a great way to picture it. And each one of those 88 levers is operated by 4 men. So that is 352 men in total.
Okay.
Using a 5-meter wooden arm bearing against the block, they achieve a 20-to-1 mechanical advantage. But here's the crucial mechanism. It only works if those 352 men push in perfect microscopic synchrony.
Like to the exact second.
To the millisecond. They likely use rhythmic drums or chants to time their breathing and their muscle exertion to overcome the static friction of the stone. If they manage that unified push just, say, 15 times an hour, they would move that 800-ton stone about 4.8 meters a day.
Wait, so you're telling me it isn't actually impossible to move 800 tons with just wood and human strength? We just think it is because we can't fathom the patience required.
Exactly. At 4.8 meters a day, factoring in realistic efficiency losses, bad weather, and fatigue, it would take between 7 and 9 months to move one block the required 800 meters.
That's it.
In historical terms, yeah, that is just a single campaigning season. It is entirely feasible.
That completely shatters my perspective. I mean, we look at a megalith and think it requires aliens simply because our modern brains cannot fathom spending 9 months moving one single rock. We are totally obsessed with quarter-by-quarter tech cycles.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, the new smartphone comes out in September, the corporate earnings report is due in December. If a project takes longer than a fiscal year, we abandon it. But these ancient societies operated on a generational timescale. A man in the ancient world would happily lay a foundation, sweat over it for decades, knowing full well that only his grandson would see the building actually finished.
But that raises the next big question. If the physics required to move the blocks isn't magic, but rather extreme, sustained human coordination, How did ancient societies actually get thousands of people to commit to decades of grueling, monotonous labor without the whole system falling apart?
Right, because the math of the labor is staggering once the paper lays it out. If you have, say, a small ancient city-state of just 10,000 people and you dedicate 30% of your workforce to a temple project for 20 years,
It adds up fast.
it results in 150 million labor hours.
150 million hours of human effort, all pointed at a single unified purpose. But arithmetic alone does not explain human motivation.
No, not at all.
Modern sociological intuition tells us that if you try to force people to do that, the system will leak. People will shirk their duties, they will hoard resources, they will revolt, or they will simply do a terrible, sloppy job.
And the immediate assumption most people make today is, well, they must have been slaves. They were whipped into doing it under threat of death. But the paper completely dispels the myth of pure slave labor, and the mechanism here is fascinating.
Right, the Egyptian monument builders.
Yes. The author looks at the builders at a village called Deir el-Medina. These were the artisans building the incredibly elaborate royal tombs of the New Kingdom. And they weren't chained to the rocks. They actually had state-provided medical care.
Which is incredible for the time period.
Truly. They were paid in substantial rations of grain, fish, and oil. And in the year 1159 BCE, they staged the first recorded labor strike in human history.
Yeah, they literally marched to the nearby mortuary temples, sat down, and flatly refused to work. And the underlying reason was that their fish and grain rations were 18 days late.
That's amazing.
The administration didn't send in the military to execute them either. Officials actually negotiated, delivered the delayed rations, and the workers voluntarily went back to the tombs.
They were basically union guys complaining to upper management. That proves they were operating under a mutually understood social contract, not pure brute force coercion. Coerced labor gives you the absolute bare minimum effort required to avoid a beating.
Exactly.
It does not give you the flawless, millimeter-perfect granite sarcophagi we find carved in the dark tunnels of the Serapeum. You only get that level of care from deep, sustained, multi-generational commitment. The closest modern analogy the paper gives is the construction of Notre Dame de Paris.
Right. Notre Dame took roughly 180 years to construct. The wealthy patrons funding it, the guilds contributing the intricate stained glass, the masons cutting the limestone. None of them, not a single one, expected to live to see it finished.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that mindset.
It really is. To explain what drove them, the paper introduces the concept of unified social energy. It's a state of societal alignment produced by 4 specific structural conditions.
Let's break those down because they seem to build on each other. The first is a shared cosmological framework, meaning everybody in the society fundamentally agrees on the nature of the universe and their specific place within it.
Right, the society operates on a common structure of meaning. If everyone believes the temple keeps the cosmos balanced, building it isn't a chore, it's an existential necessity. The second condition is unified governance and religion.
So the state and the spiritual authority aren't competing for your loyalty or your taxes. They are the exact same institution.
Yes, the administrative apparatus and the moral apparatus are totally fused. The third condition is collective identity. The primary unit of self-understanding is the group, the lineage, or the city-state, not the atomized individual.
Which perfectly sets up the fourth condition, which is non-optional social obligation. You don't get to just opt out, quit your job at the quarry, and go find yourself on a 6-month backpacking trip. You are structurally required to contribute to the collective project.
When a society aligns those 4 conditions, religion ceases to be just a personal belief system. It acts as what the paper calls a vertical trust technology.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we are conditioned to think of trust horizontally. Like, I trust you to show up for this recording. You trust the listener to tune in. That is horizontal. But vertical trust is entirely different.
How so?
Vertical trust is like running a massive, multi-generational relay race where you will never actually see the finish line, but you have absolute unbreakable faith that the next runner will be there to take the baton from your hand. It binds the past, the present, and the future into one cohesive unit. You spend your life building the cathedral because you inherently trust your great-grandchildren will finish the spire.
What's fascinating here is how the Enlightenment and our current era of modern rationalism are incredibly efficient at horizontal persuasion. We can debate each other right now, compromise, and agree on a trade policy or a tax law.
Right.
But rationalism has incredibly weak vertical strength. It severely struggles to bind unborn future generations to a shared sacrificial project.
So if atomization is the inevitable result of losing that vertical trust, what was the actual trade-off? I mean, if ancient societies had this superpower of unified social energy, why don't we just operate like that today? What did we buy with that lost coherence?
Now, I want to pause here for just a second, because the paper wades into some incredibly charged political territory regarding individual freedom versus state expansion. And just to be clear to you listening, our mission today isn't to pick a political side or make a moral judgment. We're just mapping out the architectural blueprints of this author's theory.
Yes, absolutely. We are purely reporting the structural institutional economics argument presented in the text. We are just looking at the mechanics under the hood.
Exactly. So the paper uses a framework called coordination cost, which heavily parallels the work of the institutional economist Douglas North. Every society on Earth requires human coordination just to survive, and you essentially have two choices on how to pay for it.
Okay.
You can rely on informal, low-cost coordination. This relies on shared norms, rigid social values, and high cultural homogeneity. People cooperate seamlessly because they implicitly expect the exact same behavior from everyone else.
So informal coordination is incredibly efficient.
It is. But if a society loses those informal norms, if it diversifies its values or prioritizes individualism, it has to rely on formal, high-cost coordination. This means creating endless laws, complex regulations, compliance officers, and a massive, expensive state apparatus just to get people to interact safely.
To put a modern spin on it, in a high-trust, informal society, a handshake seals a multi-million-dollar business deal. In a low-trust, formal society, you need a 50-page HR manual and a legal team just to explain how two employees are allowed to speak to each other in the break room.
That's a perfect analogy.
The friction is enormous. And this leads us to what the paper calls the freedom paradox. Modern society deliberately decided to dismantle those non-optional social obligations. We wanted to maximize individual liberation. We wanted to be free to choose our own identities, our own moral frameworks, and our own life paths.
Right. To liberate the individual, we had to smash the rigid informal rules, because rigid rules are inherently exclusionary to nonconformists. But once those informal shared norms were gone, society still had a desperate need to coordinate food, logistics, and defense.
Someone still has to build the roads.
Precisely. And so the central state had to massively expand to manage the resulting coordination failures. Ancient governance was what the paper defines as directional. It was totalitarian in its grand objective. The state said, we are all building this pyramid, but it lacked the capacity, or really the interest, to manage the granular texture of your daily life.
The pharaoh did not care what you packed in your kid's lunchbox or how you sorted your recycling. The daily cultural norms handled all of that automatically.
Modern governance, by contrast, is comprehensive. It leaves you theoretically free to choose your identity and your overarching life path, but it heavily manages the minutiae of everyday economic and social interactions through an endless, expanding web of regulations. It has to, because the atomized individuals no longer share an informal, universally accepted rulebook.
So let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. The paper argues that by intentionally dismantling our cultural rules so we could become more personally free, we actually structurally force the government to become more intrusive just to keep the supply chains running and society functioning.
That is the core of the paradox. The relationship between societal coherence and civilizational capacity isn't a straight upward line. The author graphs it as an inverted U-shape.
An inverted U. Okay.
On the bottom left, you have scattered, incoherent tribes with low capacity. As you move up to the top middle, you hit peak civilizational coherence, think Rome at its height, or Europe during the Gothic cathedral era. But if you push too far to the right and enforce too much coherence, you get total suppression of heterodox thought. You get the rigid stagnation of late dynastic Egypt or imperial China. You hit an absolute ceiling of innovation.
But the danger is that if you rebel against that rigidity and dismantle the coherence entirely, you slide all the way down the other side of the curve into extreme atomization and coordination failure. People become completely isolated. And the paper makes a very aggressive argument that we are currently sliding rapidly down that atomization side.
And if atomization is the result of ultimate freedom, we have to look at what the actual glue was that kept those peak historical societies from fracturing in the first place. The paper points to one specific historical social norm that acted as the ultimate linchpin for this entire system of trust.
And this brings us to our second impartiality warning. This next section deals heavily with human relationships and sexual norms. Again, to be clear, we are reporting an analysis of structural incentives and historical data, not delivering a moral endorsement of traditionalism. We're just following the math of the paper to its logical conclusion.
Right. So in 1934, an Oxford anthropologist named J.D. Unwin published a massive and honestly largely ignored study called Sex and Culture. He spent years studying 86 different societies across a wide span of history and geography, and he found a correlation that he famously described as having monotonous regularity.
Monotonous regularity, meaning no matter the continent, no matter the era, the exact same pattern happened over and over and over again.
Yes. Societies that maintain strict constraints on sexual behavior, specifically enforcing premarital chastity and monogamous pair bonding, demonstrated significantly higher civilizational energy. They expanded, they innovated, they built a grand architecture, they thrived.
Wow.
But the moment a society relaxed those norms and prioritized sexual liberation, the civilization consistently and measurably contracted within exactly 3 generations.
That is an incredibly bold claim. I mean, why would who people sleep with have any structural impact on building a monument or a civilization?
Well, the paper points to 2 very specific sociological mechanisms to explain the why behind Unwin's data. The first is trust infrastructure.
Trust infrastructure, okay.
If you imagine an ancient community, if a man needs to leave his household to go fight a defensive war or spend 9 months at a quarry moving an 800-ton stone, he fundamentally has to trust his neighbors. If the sexual norms of his community are completely unregulated and anything goes, the defection risk is far too high. It becomes individually irrational for him to leave his family unprotected.
He's going to do the math and say, I'm not leaving my farm for a year. Someone is going to steal my wife and my property while I'm gone.
Exactly. Reliable, rigidly enforced monogamy norms acted as trust infrastructure. They artificially removed that defection risk from the equation. A man could leave to build the monument because the severe social framework made his return to an intact family a highly credible expectation. The radius of trust extended outward from the household to the entire society.
And the second mechanism is what the paper calls stake distribution. This one is completely brutal, but it explains so much. In unregulated natural primate sexual competition, a tiny fraction of high-status males manages to capture almost all the reproductive access.
Right, in a state of pure sexual liberation, human mating defaults to highly unequal hierarchies. It leaves a massive proportion of low-status, average males effectively excluded from the mating pool. They have no family, they have no lineage, and therefore they have absolutely no structural stake in a long-term survival of the society.
They just check out.
Worse, they become deeply resentful defectors. They cause immense political instability.
So what does this all mean? I look at this like corporate equity. If you work at a hypergrowth startup, but you have zero equity, no stock options, and absolutely no chance of ever getting any, you aren't going to work weekends to build the company.
Of course not.
You'll just punch the clock, do the bare minimum, or worse, you'll steal laptops from the IT closet because you feel exploited. The paper is essentially saying that ancient enforced monogamy was basically universal stock options for civilizational building. It distributed the stakes so that the vast majority of men had a structural, biological reason to invest their labor into a future they wouldn't live to see.
That's a really sharp way to look at it. And Unwin noted a very specific 3-generation lag when these norms relax. Elites usually defect from the restrictive norms first. The first generation experiences the relaxation purely as joyous liberation. The second generation inherits a significantly weakened social framework. But the society still functions because the institutions have historical inertia. By the third generation, however, you inherit the full structural consequences: fragmented trust, heavily skewed stake distribution, and towering institutions that have completely lost their underlying motivational fuel.
So if Unwin's 3-generation lag is a real sociological law, let's look at the actual data, because we are currently living in the 3rd-generation post-sexual revolution of the 1960s. If this theory holds up, what does the math show for us right now?
The white paper's appendices present some deeply stark statistics to illustrate this 3rd-generation wall. Let's look at interpersonal trust in the United States. The basic percentage of people who answer yes to the survey question, most people can be trusted. During the first generation of liberation in 1967 and 1968, that metric peaked at about 56%. Today, in 3rd generation, it has literally halved, sitting stubbornly around 26 to 30%.
Half the country no longer trusts their neighbor. That is wild. So if trust is collapsing today, the ultimate proof of whether people still have a stake in the future would be whether they are actually creating a future generation. What does the paper's data say about birth rates?
In 1960, the OECD average fertility rate was 3.3 children per woman, a highly robust growing population. By 2022, it plummeted to 1.5.
Wow.
That is drastically below the 2.1 replacement rate needed just to sustain a population, let alone grow it. Today, 37 out of 38 OECD countries are experiencing below replacement fertility.
But the most shocking statistic to me in the entire paper, like the absolute ultimate measure of whether people have skin in the game, is their willingness to physically defend the society. In 1990, the second generation, 79% of Americans said they would be willing to fight for their country. By 2023, the third generation, that figure had fallen to 41%. It nearly halved in 30 years.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper argues we are no longer just looking at isolated data points. We are looking at a mutually reinforcing negative feedback loop. Declining social trust increases the immediate need for heavy, formal governance overhead.
Right.
That heavy bureaucratic governance alienates people and further erodes informal trust. Meanwhile, plummeting fertility ruins future workforce capacity and fiscal stability, which creates severe economic anxiety, leading to even less trust and fewer children. Systems trapped in these kinds of structural feedback loops do not spontaneously recover on their own.
If you are listening to this and you've been looking around your city or your newsfeed, wondering why there seems to be an absolute epidemic of anxiety, deep social isolation, a pervasive feeling that nobody really wants to invest in the future anymore, this paper is arguing that you aren't crazy. Your perception is entirely accurate. And more importantly, it is not a moral failing on your part. It is the highly predictable, mathematically measurable output of a society that intentionally removed the structural conditions of collective purpose. We comprehensively optimized our entire culture for individual freedom, and the direct trade-off was the total loss of the collective substrate that makes that freedom feel meaningful over time.
We solved the mystery of the monument problem by finally realizing what we lost. Ancient peoples weren't biologically better than us. They possessed no magic, and they certainly didn't have alien technology. They were just configured differently on a sociological level. They willingly traded massive individual capability for unimaginable collective coherence.
And we made the exact opposite trade. We traded collective coherence for massive, unprecedented individual capability. We achieved incredible scientific acceleration, universal human rights, and beautiful intellectual freedom. But the cost was that we lost the capacity to build a vision across centuries.
The paper concludes with a stark warning. Once core coordination mechanisms degrade beyond a certain threshold, a society cannot just expect trust to bounce back naturally. Recovery requires incredibly deliberate, painful reconstruction of shared norms.
And that leaves us with a final massive question for you to mull over as you go about your day. We spent a lot of time talking about ancient cathedrals and limestone pyramids, but what about tomorrow? If humanity suddenly needed to build a modern cathedral tomorrow, say a 200-year, multi-generational project to build a self-sustaining Mars colony, or a global, century-long, agonizing effort to reverse planetary climate change, what new, purely secular vertical trust technology could possibly motivate a totally free, highly atomized populace to actually commit to it?
It is, without a doubt, the defining structural problem of our era.
How do you get someone today to endure decades of hardship, to lay a foundation, knowing that only their great-grandchildren will ever see the sky through the roof? Think about that the next time you look at a photograph of those 800-ton blocks sitting in a quarry in Lebanon. The real mystery isn't how they moved the stone. The mystery is how they moved the people. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening.